Welcome everyone. A quick note that we are recording and that this recording will be published on our YouTube channel, History at Newcastle. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land, wherever you may be located, and to pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, and in particular to the Pamalong clan of the Awabakal people of the land on which the Callaghan campus resides and where we in the room are located today. Our presenter today, friend of the series, Dr. Paula Jane Byrne, is author of Criminal Law and Colonial Subject, published by Cambridge in 1993, and Judge Advocate Ellis Bent, Letters and Diaries, published by Desert P in 2012. She has lectured in Australian and First Nations history at Macquarie University, Murdoch University and ANU, and has also taught at UNSW and UWS. She has held research positions at Sydney University, ANU and UNE, and at present she is a visiting scholar at the State Library of New South Wales. Her paper today is titled Saranna and the Bankruptcy, and over to you.
Thank you very much. And thanks for having me in Newcastle once again. I'd like to acknowledge the Awabakal people on whose land I'm giving this paper. I would also like to acknowledge Wonnarua people and their sovereignty. This paper is one of a series entitled Women and Intellectual Life in New South Wales, 1830 to 1900, centred on the Rusden family of Maitland, who arrived in New South Wales in 1834 to join their son Frank Rusden, who was a surveyor. The eldest daughter of Anne Rusden, Saranna Scott, married Helenus Scott of Glendon near Singleton. Saranna Scott is similar to her sister Rose Selwyn in that it is difficult to find a great deal of material written by her in the State Library. We know her second-hand in a way, with only 4 letters surviving to her husband and another to her father and one to her mother. There are several hundred addressed to her by her mother, Anne Rusden, responding to questions she raised. Saranna married Helenus Scott in 1835. The Scott brothers, Robert and Helenus, were granted an estate they called Glendon by the Governor of New South Wales in 1826. Like most hunter landowners, they squatted land further into the north and west. Robert Scott died in 1844. A bankruptcy is a crumbling of a life, and in the Scott papers we're able to witness such a collapse, common to so many during this period, in order to see how these people passed their loss, and indeed money itself. Before I talk of the bankruptcy, it's necessary to mention 2 influences. We have to travel to the India of 1797, where Helenus Scott Sr. held a position buying medical supplies on the medical board of Bombay and Assay. He was in the service of the military of the East India Company and at that time trading and really surviving because of the Maratha state. Scott was part of that sprawling bureaucracy that was beginning to disentangle itself from old corruption under the increasing surveillance of the British government. Letters from Scott in Bombay to his wife Augusta at Poway, further north. You can see Poway on this map. The dissecting line, the horizontal line, if you look across to the island of Bombay, you'll see the word Poway written. Letters from Scott in Bombay to his wife Augusta at Poway further north. These letters are to be found in the Scott papers, and they give an indication of the importance of the State Library of New South Wales collections to the history of India. In what H.V. Bowen has beautifully described as the soft edges of the company, employees were able to conduct commercial enterprises, and Helenus Scott seems to have had several estates near Bombay. Augusta Scott had the management of the estate at Poway, and it appears other estates in her husband's absence. Helenus Scott Sr. wrote to Augusta in March 1797, "You succeeded so well in the business of Poway that I must now employ you on neighbouring estates. Tell the Mr. to send for Ratmart's people and tell them to plant in his cane ground, just cut down, about 6 to 8 rears of cotton, just as we're doing at Poway. Tell Sudaji to put 3 seeds in every hole, as I now have plenty of seed. In this quote, we can see Augusta's position managing the workers on this estate. Though it is under Scott's direction, that's an example of an estate. That's not the one, that's an example. Helenus produced spirits or arak on his estate at Parway, and there was a civil case brought by the company over this, which Helenus lost. He told his wife he would return to Scotland with £5,000 or £10,000 and breed horses, and this plan would influence the family's later move to New South Wales. There were several rebellions against English occupation of Bombay and alteration of agricultural land. In the 1790s, there was a fire at one house where the Scots nearly lost all of their possessions. Another letter in 1797 arranges for the family's removal on palanquins. In 1783, Scott published The Adventures of a Rupee in London, an It novel where an object narrates, and these are very popular at the time, the It novel. The Rupee has a decidedly Enlightenment disposition, and one of its lines is, "Happy women of England, whom custom and religion have made the equals of men." The economic responsibility given to Augusta was expected, and there's an indication that other wives were so engaged. Like the Mem Sahib discussed by Indira Ghosh, these women were active. For Ghosh, the white woman in India was composed differently, and the kind of femininity she expressed distinct. Victoria Haskins has also mentioned the influence of the Mem Sahib, eating out from India. In my view, the exchange of ideas and military travel around the colonies in the 18th and early 19th century meant such responsibilities may have had wider influence in the emergence of early feminism, particularly since the daughters were able to vote at East India House. The second influence is to be found at Lewisham Hill School near London, from where Elizabeth Crystal and her sister wrote to the daughters of the Rusden family. These women were the sisters of the poet Anne Button Crystal and the watercolourist Joshua Crystal. These letters were prescriptive, telling the girls how best to live their lives, advising which subject they might choose to specialise in, and to avoid the gossip generally associated and calling on others. They expressed concern for the body as well as the mind. The content of these letters brings into question the understanding of mothering in the 19th century, because direction comes from a number of women, not just the woman who gave birth to you. I'm not sure today if we would like such involvement in our children's development. Margot Finn's work on Mrs. Chitty on the East India Company, where the word mother was transferable to female relatives, is relevant here. Mothering is also apparent in the letters Georgiana Rusden, Saranna's sister, wrote to Saranna's son Henry. As the oldest, Saranna would have had most contact with the Crystal sisters in England. The Crystals moved in London artistic circles, and they were friends of Mary Wollstonecraft, Robert Southey, and Anna Bumald, and were in close contact with Saranna's grandmother, the popular actress Sarah Harlow. There were also links to India, and Elizabeth Crystal writes from East India House in one letter. Much remains to do, she writes. Every art, every science opens an inexhaustible field for talent, and every virtue for active exertion. You are not placed by Providence among the dull and inert part of his creations, but blessed with so much to draw you out from the common class of negatives in society. Elizabeth Crystal expressed an evangelical Anglicanism. This is most apparent in her poetry. She wrote, "Amidst a wide world replete with pain, rising successfully is born man, anxious man, condemned to toil, by joys deceived, by passions torn. She seems less adventurous in her religious thinking than Anne Rusden, and more likely to use religion in a prescriptive manner than as an opening for discussion. It is science that influences her, geography, taxonomy, travel, and minerals. These give her letters life. These two influences, with their links to India, give a different meaning to the words woman and mother, words carrying with them connotations of action, intellectual independence, and joint care and control of children. I want to talk about the insolvency now. There are three contemporary explanations for the insolvency of Helenus Scott Jr. in New South Wales in 1848. The first, in his obituary, states he was ruined by the Bank of Australia. The second view, held by his uncle Patrick Scott of Dundee, was that Robert Scott, Helenus's brother, who died in 1844, had speculated extensively. The third view, held by Anne Rusden, was that it was the work of God, and his reasons could not be fathomed. I will deal with each of these causes in turn. Barry Deister's excellent essay on the economic crisis of the 1840s and the histories of the banks is on the ADB website. Briefly, the cause was insecurity and credit in North America, affecting London banking houses, drought in New South Wales, and the need to import grain, followed by a goods season and a consequent glut, oversupply of wool, and land speculation. I want to approach this insolvency, though, through 19th century eyes, and this is much in common with what is called the New Capitalist history, and Ben Huff and Hannah Forsyth are examples of that. Their work is an example of that. At the time of his death, Helenus Scott's, the younger's funeral had been planned by the police of Newcastle. He was to be honoured by lines of police as befitted a long-serving and admired police magistrate. But the body was taken to Singleton, where he was farewelled by the landed and squatting community as one of the colony's elite. The obituary includes an account that may have come from vernacular history that he had been, as a squatter, ruined by the Bank of Australia. This may have been the family account. The financial difficulties that resulted in the insolvency originated far earlier and perhaps to be found in the way the estate was originally set up. Helenus Scott Sr. had died in 1821 at the Cape of Good Hope on his way to Australia with his three sons, Robert, Helenus and Walker. Walker returned to London to his mother. Helenus Scott Sr.'s money was held in trust, and the major beneficiary of that trust was Augusta Scott Sr., who was the major decision maker in the dispensation of that money. It is in letters to and from her that we gain a sense of her view of money and Glendon, the estate that was given to the Scotts. It was her Indian connections that allowed Robert Scott to gain more land apart from the original grant to him and Helenus. Augusta writes to Robert in 1823, "You never told me if you're going to take it together. That's in your joint names. Or if you were to have a separate estates, I hope you have appointed some person to act as your agent in Sydney." She further wrote, "I trust in your good sense and affection for me not to draw for what would rest to me to pay. I sold out of the stocks, part of our principal, put it into Mr. Stokes' hands, and all of the drafts of that money has been placed into your account and the books kept for the cattle. And if you are to repay it in a few years, so much the better for me." Augusta also writes to Helenus, "We have received Robert's power of attorney, but your name should have been joined with it, as perhaps it would be better to have a separate one from you. I'll make inquiries, but I just don't have the time right now." Helenus does not seem at this point to have clear legal status in the ownership of Glendon, and this is where the language of the insolvency becomes quite dense, so that 20 years after this initial confusion, the status of Helenus is still unclear. The history of the insolvency court in New South Wales is one of reform. The old system of imprisonment for debt was replaced by one where creditors slowly lost power, and the court Helenus faced was one where creditors put in claims and the debtors' assets were auctioned, the proceeds being distributed amongst creditors, after which debts were cancelled. Robert seems to have left two wills. The first was referred to in a letter from Helenus to Saranna in August 1844, where James Mitchell tells him that Robert's will had been found and Helenus was the sole beneficiary. The second The second will is to be found in the Scott family papers. This will provided nothing to Helenus at all, but crisply divided the estate into two. Helenus was not an executor. These were friends of Robert's: James Mitchell, Alexander MacLeod, James Bowman, and Edward Charles Close. And the will suggested that Helenus may have liked to buy out Robert's share of the estate by giving a 10% deposit. Helenus was left nothing at all. The main beneficiaries of Robert's grants and farms were James Mitchell, Alexander MacLeod, Robert's brother Walker, and Peter Scott. The will was not signed, but there are indications that Helenus agents tried to argue that Robert's debts were not those of Helenus. The firm or partnership was an unstable idea from the beginning. We have the impression of Robert aggressively seeking more and more land, something his uncle Patrick Scott in Dundee thought would be very difficult to stop. In doing so, Robert was hardly alone, and indeed has much in common with all his late 1820s and 1830s contemporaries. Robert fits a culture that would be long-lasting in Australia. One did not have land to merely sit on it and try to be successful in some kind of agriculture. One had to finance loans, to loan at interest, to invest in housing, shipping and industry. Squatters loaned money at interest to each other, and this was not distinct to the colony, as Patrick Scott of Dundee details his trust's own loans to individuals. Patrick Scott of Dundee's critique of Robert's speculations was made in hindsight. For Ferdinand Brodel, this second tier of economic activity above farming, this investing and loaning and management of money, is capitalism. In letters, squatters often refer to themselves as capitalists. In a more complex understanding of capitalism, it seems more like a form of merchant capital. It is difficult to find proper listing of Robert's speculations. The insolvency papers are not complete. From newspaper reports, we know that the insolvency continued until 1849 in July, when the determination was made that the creditors obtain 6p in the pound on their money tied up with Helenus. What is clear in the insolvency papers is the extent of the Scots' holdings. And this is a list of mortgages. So Glendon was mortgaged to Patrick Scott, part of it. Part of it was mortgaged to J.S. MacDonald. Part of it was mortgaged to Darvall. There was 133 acres at Fredericton near Maitland that was mortgaged to a flour company. There was 1,200 acres at Dalkeith, mortgaged to Smith and Campbell. There was 120,000 acres in County Brisbane, etc. One can see the extent of Robert's investments and holdings from this list. This does not include what Robert refers to in his will as seized land, the taking up of Aboriginal land where the land was not property and stock, what was traded in. And stock was what was traded in, rather, so that one could ostensibly buy the run by purchasing the stock on it. Runs were transferred from person to person in the 1830s to great profit. The use of the word seized lands by Robert is telling. This is the way he viewed the land on the Barwon, that's in Kamilaroi country, and the three runs that the Scots obtained, Brothers, Muckadool and Criam, seized land. It suggests that hunters, squatters were engaged in the same kinds of legal discussions as those at Port Phillip, where the argument was if the inhabitants were conquered, the land could be legally occupied, owned by those who seized it. This provides opportunity on the one hand for treaty and on the other hand for annihilation. We can see through these mortgages how active the Scots were in obtaining more land than their estate in Glendon, granted to them by the governor. This pattern is apparent in all their fellow squatters. What is significant is the several layers of secrecy surrounding the insolvency. It is to be found in the culture of the agents and solicitors in Sydney, and subterfuge seems to surround these men. The first is Leslie Dubois of the Commercial Banking Company. And Helenus writes to Saranna, called on Mr. Duguid today, who received me very kindly and said he would be glad to assist me at all times for Robert's sake as well as my own. No one has pressed me for money, and all maintain some decency except the commercial bank, a heartily greedy lot. Mr. Duguid expresses great friendship towards Robert and towards myself, but my conversations with him give me an unfavourable opinion of him. He openly expresses his satisfaction when he has done a sharp thing and has no shame when talking of any such acts of his, from which I can clearly see he would sacrifice me to his greedy acts. The second player was the solicitor, Mr. Want, and the third player was the agent, McKay, who was full of assurances in 1846, but by January 1848 seemed dull and as if unwell and breaking. He is less decided and satisfactory in his vice than ever. By 1848, Helenus concluded that a Sydney man will do anything for money. After the insolvency case, 7,000 acres of Glendon became the property of Captain Patrick Scott, Helenus's brother in India. Helenus wrote, he thinks, no doubt, he has done me a great favour by accepting my land of 7,000 acres and allowing me the privilege of managing the land without remuneration. Helenus would be forced to seek a government position and the property would be managed by Saranna. Saranna had her own secrets, and advice by Georgiana in 1853 says, I very much liked your letter to Captain Scott. You will presume not expiate him to him in any other after communications you may have with him, but leave him to his own conjectures as to what you know. When we look at contemporary readings, we cannot rely on Patrick Scott of Dundee's analysis of speculation when everyone was involved in the same kinds of activity. We also cannot rely on the idea in the obituary that Helenus was ruined by the Bank of Australia, as the debt to the bank did not figure in the insolvency, though it may have figured earlier, though James Mitchell did figure large, and we're left with God. To see God as instrumental in the bankruptcy, we must enter utterly into Saranna's worldview, and we must feel as she did. Of the sisters, Saranna seems to have the most inquiring mind in terms of religion. Early in her marriage, she writes to Anne Rusden on Mormonism. This opposition to Calvin was centered on the will of human beings and the capacity to shape redemption. This matter of active choice is where we find Saranna's belief throughout her life. Access to the library of James Mitchell, her brother-in-law, allowed her to read in German the work of Friedrich Graeber, published in 1830. Friedrich Graeber was the Engels correspondent, and his religious views part of German evangelical thought. The influence of pietism across all kinds of theology in Germany emphasized personal experience of God's Spirit. One became close to God through one's emotions. It also included a notion of mission, so we get a lot of missionaries coming out of pietism. In 1836, she sent her mother Montgomery's Hymns, a poet who had achieved fame for his anti-slavery stance. It had come via Major Innes, who Anne claimed threw it at her. Anne said, too, it was not to her taste. Anti-slavery was still grated with those who did not support the views of humanity put forward by it. It does seem clear that someone like Saranna with these views, this idea of personal experience of God and emotion, and this engagement with anti-slavery texts, would find 1838, the year of the Mile Creek Massacre, a difficult year. But as Mark Dunn has told us, the letters from that time do not survive. Saranna read Watson on free discussion of religious ideas. This freedom perhaps prepared her less for the bankruptcy than the more rigid and the more rigid and providential views of her sister Georgiana and her mother's insistence on simplicity derived from crew marker, involving the unfathomable workings of God that I've written about elsewhere. That Saranna did suffer a religious crisis is apparent in Georgiana's letter in December 1848, where Georgiana advises, "These feelings that we struggle against, our Heavenly Father pardons." To explain Saranna's wealthy position after her marriage in 1835, Anne made use of the word comfort. This term incorporated consumption of luxuries into religious view of the world. Both God and other people could assure one's comfort. It refers originally to the position of the human body at rest, but came to incorporate objects that assured such rest, one of the major being furniture. As Maria Odile Barnes writes, the spiritual and physical were never disconnected from the concept of comfort. The peace of the lamb thus became entangled with material objects and acquisition of those objects, blessings, comforts, and conveniences of life, Anne described, and noted how considerate Robert was of Saranna's comfort. Comfort made the economy part of God, something bestowed by gracious providence. All was drawn to him. The house at Glendon was indeed luxurious. The insolvency file notes the objects in each room. This is the slide, the inventory. These notes on the inventory appear to be made by walking through the house by one of the clerks of the court. And we can see how the books are kept in 3 separate rooms. There's the books in the bedroom, 247. There's 346 books, 361 books in the sitting room, and there's 71 books in the dressing room with the cane clothes baskets and a double-barreled gun. And it made me think, we haven't got a listing of these books, but it made me think that usually with squatters, books are on display because we would say that they are cultural capital following Baudu, but these are interesting, the way that they are distributed in the house. The loss of wealth was explained by Georgiana Rusden, Saranna's sister, in terms of providence, and this was a word used more often by Georgiana than her mother. Both she and her mother thought it was not clear why God had taken all that he had given Saranna. One could never fathom his intentions. God inflicted the stroke, and yet, Anne wrote, he did not do so intentionally. Anne and Georgiana gave advice to Saranna. She was not to worry Helenus over the circumstances they found themselves in. She was to always be cheerful. This results in a bifurcation in the archive. Letters to Helenus in Sydney from Saranna while he was working through the insolvency with his agents, and later when he had taken up position as Deputy Gold Commissioner in the west of New South Wales, were cheerful and informative. Letters to Anne and other members of the family were desperate, distraught, and at times hysterical. And we can only deduce this from the replies that Saranna is given. Saranna and her family moved to the small cottage at Glendon while the big house was let. The servants in this cottage lived outside in small huts, and the kitchen was outdoors, referred to as a cooking place. Some of the difficulties Saranna faced may be demonstrated by a brief discussion of flour. Helenus wrote to Saranna that he did not want the 5 tons of flour his overseer had ordered from Cohen's store at Maitland. It was a large and heavy expense. Saranna wrote to her brother Tom that she was sure her children would starve. There would be no bread for them. A pencil note in the papers describes a servant Saranna complained of at this time. Today she had not the dinner ready till 7 minutes to 3 o'clock. As soon as the bread was cooked, she began to eat it up and cram in one of the loaves, leaving us with damper. Though Saranna kept her bells to summon servants and was choosy in her employment practices, that incident demonstrates how far the circumstances of the family had deteriorated. Because of the bifurcation in the archive, we have 2 ways of viewing Saranna. The first involves her managing the estate in Helenus' absence. In 1844, we find Saranna taking instructions as how to manage the estate from Helenus in Sydney while he was taking possession of Robert's affairs. After 1848, like Augusta at Poway, Saranna had the management of the men and overseers at Glendon, now in the hands of Patrick Scott. Helenus' brother in India, a military officer with no knowledge or interest in farming, but very much interested in the profits that he could make. That she ran the estate was recognised locally, and it's apparent when overseas talk about Mrs. Scott's sheep. Management, like Augusta, seems expected. A financial solution for Saranna came when Elizabeth Crystal in 1849 sent her an amount of money. Patrick Scott of Dundee sent £1,000 in 1854 to be paid at once or £100 a year, as I like it, she wrote. It was in Saranna's name. I have riches, Saranna wrote to Helenus. Saranna asked David Scott how she should invest the money. Should she send it to George in Melbourne to invest? It's difficult to track this money, though Saranna did write of appointing a trustee. I think it was her father. At first, I assumed it disappeared into the insolvency, but Saranna seems to have had a capacity to refuse to sign a deed in 1853 as joint signatory, and she writes to her father to transfer money on her behalf. She corresponds with Patrick Scott in Dundee while keeping information from her brother-in-law, Patrick Scott, who has wanted her to sign the deed. The Rusden sisters were busily employed in copying all of the correspondence for Saranna, so there would be a record of such communication. The trust was the means by which this money was kept away from the insolvency. I do find trusts in other places. Augusta Scott, as we know, held money in trust. Rose Rusden and later Rose Selwyn had £1,000 in trust. Squatting women like Anne Hobler and Annie Tyndall had their own trust accounts. And the interest was made payable to their husbands on marriage. Georgiana and Grace Rusden both had money in trust for them. And Grace, when she died, had considerable real estate holdings. Saranna's money from Miss Crystal may have been protected in such a way. Sending children out of the home, even while babies, I find common in a great many squatting families. And I think it's part of this mobile idea of mothering that I talked about earlier. Anne Rusden sends George William to live at Glendon after Saranna is married. Saranna's son Walker was sent to London to live with his aunt Amelia. Walker died soon after his arrival in London, while Saranna's nerves and her depression are mentioned quite frequently. She was able to manage Glendon and to make financial decisions exactly at the same time her nervous state is mentioned. God was indeed harsh on Saranna Scott. To her father, she wrote that one must truly suffer until one understands the grace of God. To her mother and sisters, her response was more complex. Her suffering was made plain, and she was quite erratic in her religious choices. After Walker's death, we find her despairing at not receiving communion, how much she had wanted it. Anne wrote back that, in fact, nobody got communion that day. It was too rainy. This emphasis on communion is a high church interest, and it's apparent that Saranna was becoming more mystical in her religion. She had no time for Anne's scientific interest in mesmerism and phrenology, warning her that these things came from evil. After Walker's death, she suffered further from depression, and I'm astonished at Georgiana's knowledge of depression, her sister Georgiana's knowledge of depression, and also her descriptions of what to do about it, quite modern almost. She suffered from depression, and she saw through a glass darkly, according to Anne, and she wrote of the cottage falling down and the servants being recalcitrant. Yet she was also active during this whole period, wondering if a personal letter to Edward Days Thompson would secure a position for Helenus. To place the bankruptcy in terms of contemporary views is to be confronted by a rapidly moving investment landscape where speculation was a way of life, including the mortgage, I think. And we might include women's trusts as part of that investment landscape, so therefore part of the colonisation. So much of the life Saranna and her family led depended on ideas that find their origin in religion. Comfort and the accumulation of goods was a state of being peaceful and sated. This is where Saranna resided. When that was taken by God, for reasons of his own, she managed the estate, at the same time making her depression and desperation apparent to her mother and sisters. She retreated to a female world for religious solace. That also in its relaying advice, its copying and loaning of money, and its trusts played an active part in the capitalism of the squatter.
Okay, so I now open the floor to questions. And I might start us off. I was really struck by this idea of comfort, and it almost feels like a kind of early theology of wealth in a sense. But I was also wondering about the list of the contents in the rooms, because the list of contents seems quite incomplete. I mean, they have a sitting room with fabulous, books and ornaments and things like that, but nothing to sit on, it would seem, on the basis of that. Had the furniture already been taken in this process of?
No. And this is what you saw me crossing out as I went along. Helenus was forgiven the furniture in the insolvency case, much to the disgust of one solicitor in court. He said, "Why is this man being favoured of being allowed to keep his furniture?" Mm-hmm. So when you look at the inventory, the furniture isn't there because either it's being sold down at Maitland by the family itself to cover debts, or they keep some of it. But I think they could have kept it all to fit into the cottage. I think when Glendon was let, the furniture might still be there, and that's what happened to it. Yes, but it's annoying. I have to go to other bankrupts and other insolvency files to find lists of the actual list of furniture in a room. Mm. So yes, comfort is very interesting. It's very interesting because it's kind of the missing link as to why people consume so much all of a sudden and were emulated by their servants. Though of course there's an argument that they had their own dynamic. Servants had their own dynamic of consumption, but comfort is. It's thought to be the missing link in the history of consumption. And many years ago now, I wrote a paper on an Irish woman who used the word a great deal, and I was talking about this missing. That was a missing link because at that time people were saying, why, what's happening. But this, if you mix it with the piece of the lamb, you can see that, buying more things is only a good thing and only makes you feel better kind of thing. There's no excuses to be made, no apologies for having things.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Other questions?
I've got one, but there's one on the screen too. Sorry.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, go for it.
Good, thank you. It's Don Seaton-Wilkinson here, Paula. George Wyndham's name does not appear in your list as one of the creditors, and yet he had lent Robert Scott £5,000, and he became the mortgagee in possession of Glendon following Robert's death. And of course, Robert and Helenus had the largest horse stud in New South Wales at the time. And there's a considerable amount of correspondence in the Mitchell Library between Helenus and his wife, casting very serious aspersions on Wyndham's conduct and refusal of offers from South Australia to buy all the horses. At the end of the day, Wyndham was in charge of the estate for a number of years. And when the horses were sold, Wyndham bought most of them, and he ended up with the largest and most successful horse stud in Australia at the time. I'm just wondering, have you come across any of that material about Wyndham's relationship with the Scotts? I know that Wyndham's parents and sisters were very, very good friends of Augusta, who came out with her mother and then married James Mitchell. But yeah, I'm just wondering if you found anything about any of that.
It's very interesting, isn't it? Because I was thinking that as well. Where's George Wyndham in this? But, you know, he came and got the horses without Helenus being there. And that Helenus thought this was a shocking way to behave, which made me think there's particular ways of behaving around a bankruptcy, but nobody seems to take much notice of that. You know? So yeah, Wyndham came, and Wyndham at one point is very angry because he's not getting the horses. Yes, I've read those letters, but this is the insolvency file. He does not appear in the insolvency file, which is very interesting. So I'm wondering where he got this is mortgages that I'm looking at, and the mortgages there. You can see that if you've got it's on the screen now, but you probably may not see it, but I've got names in green. These are family members. Patrick Scott, Mrs. Noel Scott, James Mitchell, who are making, you know, who have lent the money through a mortgage kind of system, and who also, if I don't go back to creditors, then they also appear as creditors. And these people have a meeting, I think about 1853, and where they carve up, they want the deeds. They want the deeds to Glendon. They want all the deeds to all of the properties handed over. So I'm thinking, was Wyndham renting it? I don't know. I'm not sure. And as you know, George Wyndham's papers are not fantastic in this respect. But I'll tell you one thing: James Mitchell's accounts are there. James Mitchell came out of all of this very clean and very wealthy, not only out of Glendon, but out of all of the bankruptcies on the Hunter. So the Mitchell Library has got an extensive, not that I've looked at it yet, an extensive listing of his accounts. So if you see what Mitchell did, you can probably find Wyndham in there, I think. But yes, so you're just patching things together. I don't know if you found this with the Hunter, but you're patching things together and things don't match, you know. The letters, what's in the letters doesn't match what's in the insolvency file. So you're sort of trying, yes, I did have a sentence about Wyndham in there, crossed it out kind of thing, but I think the horses were very sad losses for them, because they had Dover, you know, they imported 3 horses. Dover was one of them, and Dover sired all those other horses, yeah. But I do remember Wyndham as behaving miserably, people thought, yeah.
That's interesting, because actually Wyndham put a notice in the paper that everything was being done correctly, and that all the horses were actually sold at a public auction.
Yes.
So, yeah.
He did.
That's right.
Yeah. And whether it depends who you go with, I suppose. Whether this was or was not the case, you know. The horses were for the Indian market, I think, originally. And that's the real genius in the whole situation seems to be Helenus Scott Sr. in Bombay. With all of he is really, if you read his papers, he's very much a sort of not only an Enlightenment character, but also he experiments with gunpowder. He's experimenting with cotton, which of course takes over the whole of Bombay. And he's got his business on the side of spirits that he's doing. But there's a tremendous amount of sort of energy to him. The only energy that you find in Robert is energy for, Robert acted as agent for other people, you see. He acted as an agent for other people on the Hunter. So his making of money, his investments, that's where his enthusiasm is. But for enthusiasm for life, it's Helenus Scott Senior in Bombay. Yes.
Okay, we might go to a question in the room and then back online. Kathy, did you have a
Yeah,
question?
thank you so much, Paula. So rich and really interesting. I mean, there's a vast amount of archival and repository material here. So I was really interested in your bifurcated archive argument or idea. And it also made me think about the fact that you've got insolvency files. And then you said you found a will. One of the wills is in family papers. So would most wills end up in another type of archive, or would they end up in scattered archives? What's your understanding of that?
I'm working out the wills because this will, of course, was not. It was not a legal will. It was one that he'd made out at some time, which is not dated, not even dated. And but I thought it was quite telling how he locked Helenus out of the estate. So there's, several things going on. Mark Dunn's interesting on this. I'm not sure if there's anything in his book, but he's interesting to talk to about this because of the relationship between Helenus and Robert. He seems to know slightly more than I do on that. Your question of the wills, there's wills all through that there's Scott papers and the Rusden papers as well. And I really liked the one I was reading, I think, recently because George William Rusden, he went to Glendon. And the big thing that Robert and Helenus have got is that they get very dressed up. They're very dressed up all the time. And I've written about this, about squatting men in clothes. They're very, and George William writes to his mum saying, send me my shirts that he got done by a tailor. And Anne says, no, you can make do with Tom's shirts. So he's very, very upset about this. Never mind about George and he's being upset about his shirts. The first thing in George William's will is that all his wearing apparel will go to a certain person. And I thought all his life wearing apparel because he's been with the Scots. And when you look at their accounts that they're making with London tailors, it's, they're beautifully dressed all the time. And he's trying to keep up. I often wonder with George William, and I know a lot of people have worked on him, but see, he wasn't Cambridge educated or Oxford. And so all of the people he mixed with all of his life would have been Cambridge, Oxford people. So I'm sort of, the Scots were, St. Peter's, I think, I'm not sure though, the Scots were, and so I'm wondering about this and the shape of his intellectual life in terms of that. But I love that in the will that the first thing you mentioned was the clothes. This is where my wearing apparel is to go to.
It's interesting because often, clothing would be the first item in a poor person's will because that would be the most valuable thing they owned. It's fascinating to see it in those circumstances.
Yeah.
We should go to Vicky had a question.
Thanks very much. And thanks, Paula. That was really interesting and done with your usual, really fine-grained, beautiful analysis. I just want to first of all say sorry that I wasn't able to come in. I was hoping to. I've got horrible deadlines all over the place at the moment. But I wanted to ask you a bit more. I was actually thinking about the wills myself. I wanted to ask you a bit more about the relationship with the servants. And I wondered whether there's anything that you picked up about their sense that they had to look after the servants financially in this situation, or that they owed them anything, whether they left things in their will for the servants, or whether the servants were entirely kind of alienated from the family, in a kind of modern capitalist kind of sense, as they were just employees and they came and they went.
Yeah, that's very interesting because I've written a whole thing on servants, and that's online. I haven't published it yet, but I've written in that servants are lesser human beings to the squatters. They are lesser kinds of humanity. and that they have emotional lives that are too expressive, that kind of thing, that they are different people. That's definitely from Anne. With Saranna, I'd say the same. On the other hand, the servants, there's one servant who comes looking for Saranna when she hears of the bankruptcy and is distraught and wants to see Saranna. And don't see that as being reciprocated.
Yeah.
It's a kind of mismatch, but she's there at Glendon. She's interviewing people to become, if you know Beverly Kingston's work, she's interviewing people to become general servants. So that means that the man must do yard work and wait at the table and that kind of thing. Very much a commercial relationship, and she's turning a lot of people away because they're not suitable. But in terms of your work, it's very interesting because Amelia, she comes from Singapore, and she brings her she brings her servant from Singapore with her. And when Amelia is going to sleep at night, the servant stands beside the bed and fans her until she goes to sleep.
Oh, wow.
This is a transferal of practices of being a servant.
That's right.
Singapore to New South Wales, and you sort of think, how often did this kind of thing happen? Because, you know, Robert does have, I was talking with someone here about it, Robert does have a boy, I think he calls him Baji, and he is his page. He's from India, but you see, I'm trying to work out how these people came. There's two servants that Robert has, also Kochi and his wife. They're from India, and I haven't been able to find when they came, whether they came with Augusta or how they came or how Robert. But you see, Robert might have been, and Augusta Senior is great because she was born in the Raj. She's the daughter of Colonel Fredericks, and all her language is. Did I say Raj? Sorry, all her language is. She was born in Bombay, rather. Raj, sorry, and she all her language is from India. So she says, "Oh, you're so far from the presidency. How are you going to get your things to market?" And you sort of think, I'd better go and look up what a presidency is, not being a historian. And it's where the government is located in Bombay. So all of her life she has. Unfortunately, we do not have a great deal of letters from the Mitchell family, which is odd, seeing that he set up a library. David Scott Mitchell, none of his personal papers. James Mitchell, only the money, you know? So we're missing huge gaps, and you're just piecing things together.
Yeah.
You know?
Oh, I'd really be interested in that paper you're working on servants. If you want someone to read it for you and give you some feedback, I'd be really interested, because that's some great. You've got some great snippets in there, and I love the way you approach your work and think about these things. So,
thank you.
Questions? Let's talk a little time.
I can't resist. You asked about. Sorry, you mentioned Georgiana's remedies for depression, or her knowledge of depression.
Yes.
In the little bit of time, can you say a little bit more about that?
Well, I hope I can remember it all, but Georgiana says, what you're feeling, that is the depression. That is not you, you know. This was what you would say to a person today. You think the house is falling down around you, but it's not. It's just your depression that is making you see the world that way. She also recommends what to do about depression, which I can't recall, but it's a lot of rest and that kind of thing. But what destabilizes the whole thing is Anne writing and saying, God didn't do this intentionally. So you see, that's a very specific view of God, because it's almost the mechanistic, natural theology view of God. And that Saranna's God, the kind of way she speaks of God, is this personal, emotional relationship. So saying that God didn't do this intentionally, is quite devastating to a person. Because you think, what? You know, and it was a big shock for me to read that. But I may perhaps not, because they're constantly engaged in debate, which I've got, you know, in the paper on Anne Rusden, they're constantly involved in debate and discussion, and that's made me think that the discussion is far more important than I've recognised so far in earlier work. Yeah.
Thank you.
Absolutely fascinating. So please join me in thanking Paula for an absolutely fascinating paper. Just before you go, a quick note that our next paper is on Friday, the 6th of September at the usual time of 10 a.m. and will be both online and in person. And our presenter, Ray Lawrence from Macquarie University, will present on mobility in the ancient world, an emerging multi-species perspective. And we hope to see you then.